The first time the bell rang, the farmer thought it was the wind. But when he stepped outside, there was the bear, standing tall, paw still wrapped around the rope, looking at him like he'd been waiting all along. The farm bell had hung there for generations, a tall brass relic mounted on a weathered wooden post. Its deep tone once used to call workers from the fields or signal trouble in the valley. These days, the old farmer, Walter, rang it only when his hands felt strong enough to pull the heavy rope. Most mornings it just sat silent, collecting frost. It was late November when he first saw the bear again. Walter had been stacking firewood by the barn, his breath curling white in the frigid air, when he caught movement near the tree line. The shape was familiar even at a distance: broad shoulders, thick brown coat, the slow, deliberate gait. He leaned on his axe handle, a smile tugging at the corners of his weathered face. "Well, I'll be. You came back." The bear approached without hurry, stopping just short of the fence line. He looked older now, heavier, but the intelligence in his eyes was unmistakable. Years ago, Walter had found him as a cub tangled in wire, half-starved and shivering. Nursing him back to health had taken the better part of a winter, but when spring came, the bear had wandered off into the mountains. Walter hadn't been sure he'd ever see him again. Now here he was, as real as the frost on the fence posts. Walter reached into the bucket by the barn door and pulled out a handful of apples. He tossed one gently over the fence, watching it land in the snow. The bear sniffed it, then began to eat in slow, crunching bites. That's when Walter got the idea. The bell was just a few yards away, its rope swaying slightly in the breeze. "You know," he said aloud, though he knew the bear wouldn't understand the words, "if you're gonna drop by, you oughta let me know first." He walked over, took hold of the rope, and gave it a pull. The bell's deep note rolled across the valley, scattering a flock of birds from the pine trees. The bear's head snapped toward the sound, ears pricked forward. Walter laughed softly. "Yeah. That got your attention." Walter wasn't the kind of man to waste a good idea once it took root. The next morning, he was waiting by the bell when the bear appeared again, lumbering out of the pines with snow dusting his back. "Morning, big fella," Walter greeted, his voice warm despite the chill. In one hand, he held a bucket of apples and the last of the honey from his pantry. In the other, he gripped the bell rope. He rang it once, the low, resonant tone carrying into the still air. The bear flinched slightly, then looked at Walter as if weighing the meaning. "See? Ring, then food." Walter set an apple on the snow in plain view, then tapped the rope with the back of his knuckles. The bear's eyes followed the motion. For the better part of an hour, Walter repeated the process: tug the rope, let the bell sound, then reward with an apple or a smear of honey on a flat board laid over the snow. At first, the bear only watched, ears twitching with each peel. But curiosity has a way of working its claws into even the most cautious of animals. By the fourth try, the bear stepped closer. His breath came in warm puffs as he sniffed the rope, nose brushing against the rough fibers. Walter stayed perfectly still, letting him investigate. The bear nudged the rope once, just enough to set it swaying. Walter quickly placed an apple on the snow. "That's it. Good lad." The next attempt was more deliberate, a swipe of the paw, the rope swinging hard enough for the bell to let out a half-muted clang. Walter laughed, the sound echoing almost as far as the bell's note. By the end of the morning, the bear had figured out the sequence: pull rope, get treat. He wasn't graceful, twice he nearly toppled the post with his weight, but the satisfaction in his deep huff afterward was unmistakable. As the bear wandered back toward the woods, Walter leaned against the post, smiling to himself. If the valley heard that bell in the coming weeks, it might not be him ringing it. 3 days passed without a sign of him. Walter had begun to wonder if maybe the bear had already moved on for the season, heading deeper into the mountains to find a den. Then, just after sunrise on the 4th day, Walter was in the barn mending a cracked shovel handle when a deep, resonant clang rolled through the air. He froze mid-swing, heart giving a small leap. That wasn't the wind. He stepped out into the crisp morning, breath pluming in front of him, and followed the sound. Another clang, then another, uneven but strong, the rope clearly being yanked rather than nudged by chance. Walter rounded the corner of the barn, and there he was, the bear, standing tall on his hind legs, paw wrapped clumsily around the rope, eyes bright with focus. Each pull made the bell rock wildly on its mount, the low note carrying far across the snow-covered fields. The sight made Walter laugh out loud, the sound mixing with the bell's tone. "Well, you remembered." He didn't rush forward, just stood and watched, letting the bear finish his grand performance. After the 5th ring, the bear dropped back down onto all fours, turning toward Walter with a low huff that almost sounded expectant. Walter fetched the bucket of apples from the porch and rolled one across the snow. The bear caught it between his paws, crunching down with slow satisfaction. It hit Walter then, the valley had heard that bell too. And in a town where nothing stayed secret for long, it wouldn't be long before others came to see for themselves. He looked up at the brass bell, still swaying gently, and grinned. "Guess we just started something, didn't we?" By the time the bear had finished his 2nd apple and lumbered back toward the tree line, Walter could already hear the distant hum of an engine. Out here, that sound carried far, and it didn't take much guessing to know why it was headed this way. 15 minutes later, a dusty blue pickup crunched into the yard, snow spraying from its tires. Out climbed Pete Dwyer, Walter's neighbor from half a mile down the road. "You hear it too?" Pete asked, pulling off his cap. His breath fogged in the cold. Walter smirked. "Wasn't me ringing it." Before Pete could reply, the bell sounded again, a full, strong peal that made them both turn. At the far side of the yard, just beyond the fence, the bear stood on his hind legs, tugging at the rope with slow, deliberate motions. Pete blinked, then let out a low whistle. "Well, he's doing it on purpose." By midday, word had spread beyond Pete. 2 kids on bicycles showed up, skidding to a stop in the snow. Then came Clara from the post office, her scarf wrapped so high you could barely see her eyes, and old Henry in his beat-up Ford. They all stood at a polite distance, watching as the bear rang the bell yet again, each clang sending a ripple of laughter and disbelief through the small gathering. Walter didn't make a big show of it. He simply tossed another apple toward the bear and let him be. But inside, he felt something warm settle in his chest. This wasn't just a visit anymore, it was a ritual. And it was only a matter of time before the whole town knew that when the bell rang, it wasn't trouble calling, it was a friend. It didn't take long for the bell's tone to become part of the valley's daily soundtrack. By the end of the week, the sound no longer startled anyone, it made them smile. Folks would pause mid-task, cock their heads, and say, "Walter's bear is back," before going about their business or grabbing a bag of apples to bring along. On Saturday morning, Walter stepped onto his porch to find 3 cars already parked at the end of his drive. Families bundled in thick coats climbed out, children holding small baskets of fruit. The bear was sitting just inside the fence, waiting patiently, his breath pluming in the frosty air. The bell rope swayed gently. He'd already rung it once, enough to summon his growing audience. Clara from the post office came forward first, an apple in each mittened hand. Walter nodded to her. "Just toss it underhand, not too close." She did, and the bear leaned forward, scooping the fruit into his jaws with surprising delicacy. The children giggled. One boy asked if he could try ringing the bell. Walter chuckled. "That's the bear's job now." The crowd stayed for nearly an hour, watching the bear alternate between ringing the bell and accepting treats. Walter kept a careful eye on the distance, making sure no one crossed the fence line. He knew the animal's trust was hard-earned and easily broken. When the bear finally rose to his full height and ambled back toward the pines, the onlookers clapped as though they'd just seen the closing act of a show. The sound faded with the crunch of his paws in the snow. Walter stood by the bell, feeling the cold brass under his palm. This was no longer just a private reunion. Somehow, the bear had stitched himself into the fabric of their little town. And as much as Walter valued his solitude, he couldn't help but like the way that felt. The winter deepened, and with it, the snow lay thick over the fields. Most mornings were quiet now, the bell silent under a crust of frost. Walter assumed the bear had retreated to a den somewhere in the hills. Then, one gray afternoon, as Walter was mending a fence post near the barn, the bell's deep, wavering tone rolled across the yard. Something in the sound was off. It lacked the usual strong rhythm, instead, it came in uneven, hesitant pulls. Walter dropped his tools and made for the bell. As he rounded the corner, he saw the bear standing there, but it was immediately clear something wasn't right. His head hung lower than usual, and his coat was dusted not with fresh snow, but with a fine mat of frozen clumps clinging stubbornly to his fur. He pulled the rope once more, weakly, the bell giving a half-hearted clang before settling. Walter's stomach tightened. "Easy there, boy, what happened to you?" The bear shifted his weight awkwardly, favoring one side. As Walter moved closer, he spotted a dark stain against the white of the snow near the bear's left shoulder, not large, but enough to send a jolt of worry through him. The onlookers had begun to gather, drawn by the bell. A few gasps cut through the cold air when they noticed the animal's condition. Walter turned to them sharply. "Stay back. Give him space." He fetched the bucket of apples, setting one down slowly on the snow. The bear took it, chewing slowly, his breath labored. Walter's mind was already racing. An injury in this weather could be deadly if not addressed quickly. "I'll get Pete," Clara offered from the fence line, her voice tight with concern. Walter nodded without looking away from the bear. "And tell him to bring the sled." The bear's eyes met his then, tired but trusting. The same look Walter had seen years ago when he first freed him from the wire. And just like then, he knew he wouldn't let the animal face this alone. Pete arrived within 20 minutes, his old snowmobile rumbling up the drive, a wooden sled hitched to the back. He jumped off, his breath steaming in the cold, eyes narrowing when he saw the bear's condition. "Looks bad," Pete muttered. Walter nodded grimly. "We'll need to move him somewhere sheltered." The bear stood still, watching them. Walter moved slow, his voice calm and low. "Easy now, boy, no one's here to hurt you." He tossed another apple, then a second. Each one drew the bear a step closer to the open gate. Pete positioned the sled just beyond, the wooden planks lined with old blankets. "Think he'll climb on?" "Not a chance," Walter said, shaking his head. "We'll have to get him to sit, then ease it under." It took patience, and more apples than Walter would have liked to part with, but eventually the bear lowered himself to the snow, exhaustion outweighing his caution. Walter knelt near his massive shoulder, eyes scanning the wound. It was a shallow gash, likely from a broken branch or a tangle with barbed wire, but in the freezing temperatures, infection could set in quickly. With Pete's help, Walter slid the sled beneath him, the wood creaking under the bear's weight. The animal gave a low huff but didn't resist. They hauled him slowly toward the barn, the snowmobile tugging the sled at a cautious crawl. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and wood smoke, warmer than the biting air outside. Walter had already cleared a corner, laying down fresh straw and setting up an old heat lamp. Once the bear was settled, Walter cleaned the wound with warm water, his hands steady despite the closeness of the massive animal. The bear watched him the whole time, eyes half-lidded, breathing deep but calm. Pete stood by the door, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd have a bear bedded down in your barn." Walter gave a small smile without looking up. "Guess you haven't been paying attention the last few years." For the next few days, the barn became the warmest place in the valley, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Walter kept the heat lamp on day and night, its soft orange glow spilling across the straw where the bear lay. Twice a day, he cleaned the wound, applying a homemade salve his father had once used on injured livestock. The bear tolerated it all, barely flinching, his trust in Walter as steady as the snow outside. He ate well, apples, oats soaked in warm water, even a few jars of honey donated by Clara from the post office. Word had spread quietly. Folks didn't come in crowds anymore, instead, they visited one or two at a time, peeking through the half-open barn door or standing quietly by the fence. They'd leave offerings, a sack of grain, a bag of apples, a folded blanket, and whisper their good wishes as if the bear might somehow understand. On the third afternoon, Pete arrived with his young granddaughter, Lily. She stood just inside the doorway, eyes wide. "He's so big," she breathed. Walter crouched beside her. "Bigger than most, but gentle. You just keep your voice soft." The bear lifted his head at the sound of her small voice, sniffing the air before settling back down. Lily smiled shyly. "Does he know you saved him?" Walter glanced at the massive shape in the straw, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "I think he does." By the end of the week, the wound was closing cleanly, the bear moving with more strength. One morning, Walter walked in to find him sitting upright, the bell rope Walter had hung from a rafter dangling just in front of him. Somehow, during the night, he'd managed to pull it. A single, soft chime had woken Walter in the farmhouse. It made him chuckle. Even here, the bear had found a way to keep the tradition alive. The morning came crisp and clear, the kind of winter day where the air feels sharper than glass. Walter opened the barn door to find the bear already on his feet, pacing slowly near the straw bed. His coat looked fuller now, the wound a dark, healed line beneath the fur. "You're ready," Walter murmured. He stepped aside, letting the bear move at his own pace. Heavy paws crunched over the packed snow as they crossed the yard together. The sun glinted off the frost that coated the fence posts, and for a moment, Walter thought of the first day he'd seen the cub, shivering and alone. The bear stopped at the base of the bell post. His head tilted upward, eyes fixed on the familiar brass shape. Walter smiled faintly. "Go on, then." With a slow, deliberate motion, the bear reared up on his hind legs. One massive paw reached for the rope, curling clumsily around it before giving it a sharp tug. The bell swung high, the first note ringing out with a deep, proud tone that rolled across the fields. Walter felt it in his chest. The bear rang it again, stronger this time, and somewhere in the distance, he heard a door slam, then another. Before long, figures began appearing along the road, Pete with his granddaughter, Clara in her red scarf, Henry with his old knit cap pulled low. They gathered by the fence, watching as the bear gave the rope one last mighty pull, the bell's note carrying all the way to the edge of the valley. The sound wasn't just a signal anymore, it was an announcement. The bear dropped back to all fours, letting out a soft huff. Walter stepped closer, his voice low. "Welcome back, friend." By the next winter, the bell had become more than just a farm fixture, it was part of the valley's identity. People didn't just recognize its sound, they waited for it. Shops would pause their work, children would press their noses to frosted windows, and the diner down in town kept a small jar by the register labeled for the bear, filled with coins for apples and honey. Walter never announced the visits. The bear came when he chose, sometimes not for weeks, other times several days in a row. But whenever that deep, resonant tone rolled through the cold air, the same quiet excitement spread through the town. On the first heavy snow of the season, Walter heard the bell at dawn. He stepped onto his porch, coffee steaming in his hands, and saw the familiar dark shape standing tall by the post. His paw gripped the rope with practiced ease, and the brass sang out across the valley. By mid-morning, the yard was dotted with neighbors, all keeping a respectful distance. Children placed apples at the fence line, adults traded knowing smiles. Pete leaned against his truck, murmuring, "You know, folks will be telling this story long after we're gone." Walter nodded. Good stories should outlive the people in them. As the bear finished his last apple and turned toward the pines, the bell rope swayed gently in the wind, its tone fading. No one called after him, they all knew he'd return when he wanted. In time, the valley's newcomers would hear about the bear who rang the bell, how he'd come to trust an old farmer, and how an entire town learned to listen for a sound that meant something rare in this world, a friendship with no demands, only respect.